everyone. Today we are here with Charles, who's a friend and also an awesome product leader. Charles has led AI products and initiatives in employee experience and HR in companies like Workday and Autodesk. He's also the lead HR tech advisor to the US Army. And in Workday, we were ERG leaders together. So, welcome, Charles. That's quite an introduction. Would you like to
Thanks,
add anything?
Mansa. Oh, I would say I'm also really passionate about product inclusion and growing our pathways into technology leadership from all backgrounds.
Yes, absolutely. And I have seen that work firsthand in Workday. So, speaking about GenAI and HR, tell us, how is GenAI transforming the landscape of HR today?
Yeah. So at a super high level in the tech companies like that we know that we've worked in, I would say, more mature, larger. I haven't seen profound shifts yet, right? Like if you go through the candidate experience, it's probably looking somewhat similar to what you're used to and the way you're doing your performances and stuff. Now, what I am noticing in some of the new companies developing, they're taking more risks in some of this and how they do stuff. And then in the more mature industry, it's kind of wait and see. So if you were to ask me, what's a big use case of Gen AI that's totally transformed HR that people know about and are pointing at, look over here, that hasn't happened yet.
So, you said the newer companies are taking more risks. Can you elaborate on that? What kind of risk?
Well, I can only like look at like things that I'm seeing. I'll give an example like that of things that we're seeing. A lot of our early career cohort, our Gen Z, they are becoming more fluent, obviously, in some of these emerging skills. So an example of them, and obviously all folks sometimes are using this, but that we see from them is they're good at getting bots to apply for like thousands of roles on their behalf. And then now we have recruiting and recruiting talent organizations just having a huge multiplication
Mhm.
of apps. So that would be an example of like a younger generation of worker coming in like, "Oh yeah, I'm just gonna do this," and us trying to catch up to how they're using it. That's one that I've seen.
Yeah, that's definitely, we're seeing more and more of that. So, being in this area, what are some of the skills and knowledge that either in the product area or the HR professionals need to adapt to this changing landscape?
Let me start with the HR professional. Just to be honest, I think there's a certain amount of anxiety, right? I have a unique career background where I'm very proud to be HR professional and a product and technologist, and I've been in IT and I've been in both spaces, so I can really relate to that. And generally, for HR professionals, like, okay, I have my technology partners over on the AT side, but now in the age of Gen AI, that relationship is getting renegotiated,
Mm.
and if we don't upskill into more fluency around technology, we're a bit at risk of losing some of our position and how businesses are making decisions. So an example that I would give is like creators, like in media and entertainment, think Hollywood, and then the streamers and the providers who have the digital layer. We've seen over the last, what, 10, 15 years that the Netflixes and have been going up. And the folks that create the content and HR create the policy, the processes, the content, if they're not part of that layer of how that technology is being consumed, there's a risk that maybe a bit left behind, but that won't be good for the workplace if that happens, right? The folks that have those really unique domain experiences across, you think about, those experiences that you have when you get a job, when you get promoted, you and I have led teams when we have both the ups and downs of leading teams. We really want to feel like we have an HR organization that understands our needs and is building technology that is adept and empathetic to us. So we need those domain experiences there. But the way our workers are more and more going to be using them is going to be more technology based. So,
That's true. It's kind of like when came around. If you don't adopt it, you can still be writing by hand. But then if you don't upskill yourself, there is a risk that you will be replaced by someone who has that knowledge. So,
yeah. And I
absolutely.
want to say something on that because a lot of my HR friends are non engineering, non product, non tech. I don't like saying it like that. Folks that are not formally in roles with those words in them is more how I would say that. They're like, "Do I need to learn how to code?" It's like, well, one, with Gen AI, even learning how to code is changing, right? In terms of that. And it's not, I wouldn't say that. What I would say is what I'd encourage someone in that position, whether you're on a recruiting team or learning development or employee relations or any of these great HR functions, is how are you finding ways of small, no risk to low risk use cases that you can use some of this technology? A great one that comes to mind is like transcribing a meeting that is non-sensitive about its content so that all of your teammates across all the time zones can then read through it. Because yeah, you can share, here's the Zoom or the Teams recording, but that's not as accessible. Not everyone's got time to, or you can have a transcription of 2 to 3 paragraphs. That's a great use case that those professionals in HR should be enabled to start doing. Because that, if you just start consuming it, then you start and using it, you start seeing, what is this Gen AI? What do these large language models do really well? What do they not do so well? And what are they totally not ready to do? You gain that by having your own experiences with the technology.
That's so true. So we talked it from the HR professional side. What about from the product side? What do the product leaders need to do?
Yeah, let me put that into 2 categories of employee experience product leaders. Those of us that, one, either are building those or integrating great vendor provided solutions. You think about ServiceNow, Workday, your Microsoft stuff, or building custom ones like I've done in-house. So that's one group. And then the other ones I think are, we're going to see some startups that are going to be building new companies that create AI tools and products for HR. Let me talk about that second group. We were at Workday. We've been in human capital software. We have ideas about this space. And I think one of the reasons why Workday just shot off is it was the first, HCM fully provided in cloud, right? In SaaS. And so it had that huge first movers advantage with this world breaking technology, software as a service, totally in the cloud. Now we're in this age where it's Gen AI, and things that are created for this Gen AI world are going to have a first mover's advantage. And no matter how great a company like Workday or an Oracle, a lot of their tech stack is built for that last era. And it's hard to just shift with all of that code and all that, like, and be ready to deliver. So I do think we're going to see some exciting new companies that are built entirely to this space. And I'm watching because, like, if you look at Slack didn't come out of Microsoft. It didn't come like, it came because millennials wanted a more human centric and fun way to share their emojis and bring their culture to the workplace. And so it came out. And I think about Zoom, which I consider an employee experience product too. Same thing in COVID, right? We were looking for a better experience, more human centered. There's going to be something like that. And I'm watching, I'm here in the Bay with you, Mamta. I'm going to be seeing, because that would be a cool thing to be, especially like those products I'm a big fan of. I do think they made the workplace more human centered and more fun. And I'm all about fun and productivity. So I'm watching, and obviously the established providers in this space are watching too, and we'll try to buy it up really quickly. So we'll see how that goes. And then in terms of the category of builders like me that build in-house, not to go too nerdy on it, but I would really map it, you know, to what a company's approach is to physical workplaces and productivity. And what I mean by that is, like, I was at Autodesk, very oriented to digital and hybrid. So we invested a lot in great tools because we knew that you can't rely on Charles and Monta sitting next to each other in Pleasanton to share information and knowledge and grow. So we needed to provide the technology. So I think companies are trending that way, but that also speaks to why it's so important to invest in that space. And for those of us that are building that way, a quick way to think about it, it's like, let's say we hire a Momta into our company, awesome executive engineering leader. How can we set up everything so that she gets fully onboarded as quickly as possible, both from a workflow and from a connection and
Mhm,
culture
mhm.
perspective? So that's like, if you're saying what's something we should be thinking about, we should be thinking about that. And how can we use LLMs and Gen AI to accelerate that in a way that is cool, not creepy, that she's a part of that journey and understands what data we're using and how there. So that would be the kind of challenge I give to that category that is building in-house.
And have it more personalized to the
Yeah,
user.
if she wants it more personalized, right? And sometimes folks want it personalized by persona. Yeah, personalize it to me based on US based or a product based. But they don't want it personalized by Charles because they don't want to know, like, are you checking what my internet search history? Now all of a sudden you're serving me cat videos. How'd you know about that? Right. So it's like listening to employees of what personalization means, because over personalized to that individual, I've seen in the workplace can immediately make people feel very uncomfortable, right? Where if
Absolutely. Yeah.
we're saying, we're giving this to you because you're a team leader and you're US based and you have a lot
Mhm.
of engineers. And based on that, we like, then that I found they're all about that.
Yeah, and also by personalization, I meant like, how do you like to learn? So maybe you like to learn via videos or maybe like online trainings or in-person trainings. So having those preferences and having the content be personalized. But yeah, we don't want
No,
too
I
much
love that example.
personalization.
That like, and I know you're going to ask me like, what are some great use cases for LLMs and AI and HR. So let's say you have a learning management system or training that is like very written based. You could be like, hey, do this in a video with like, there are ways that you can start looking at different ways to create learning experiences without the budget that you would have needed back in the day. So that's a great example of like, all right, I have a management population. Let me ask some sensing questions about how they most would like to consume learning experiences. You and I both led technical teams, and what keeping up with all the admin stuff, it's like that's like Sunday work often, right? Because we can't do it during the week. So that's a great use case where we could use Gen AI. I know Microsoft, Satya Nadella announced they want to partner with Khan Academy, and they're looking at use cases like this for students and teachers, right? So how do we look at what they're trying to do in that space for learning in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great point. So you mentioned about data and you also mentioned about over personalization and being creepy. Let's talk about that a little bit. Why do we need those guardrails? Why do we need data governance? And how should companies be looking at it?
There's lots of different ways to break that down. And the short answer I would say is like, it takes a long time to build trust and you can lose it in an instant, right? Like that's true
Say
of
that one more time.
it takes a long time to build trust and you can lose it in an instant. Like relationships work like that, right? And one thing you notice is that when companies, organizations, when they start to lose that, then they start to get lots of other questions, right? So if you, like me and you, believe that trust is an incredibly valuable capital to have with your employees, to have with your customers, and something front and center here, then that would be reason number one. And then within trust, one thing that we're seeing around how HR is changing, not just with Gen AI, but in general, is the extent to which employees now are actually the brand ambassadors of the company because
Mhm.
what they're doing out in their digital worlds and lives, we pay attention whether they really believe in it. And you can put tons of resources in your marketing, but we're going to pay attention to your employees. So that's another reason why trust with the employee is so key in how you approach these things. And if you get something wrong, like we saw this with Gemini with the visual thing where just a little bit of testing of like who could find this offensive and in a small advisory should have alerted them like, hey, there's some things here. And that's a great example too, because if you look at what Firefly and Adobe did, that they had already done this. If you ask the same prompts into Firefly that you would have in Gemini, there's that little cute Adobe monkey with a hand over saying, hey, I'm sorry, I don't do that. Right. Like, so as we look about how we use data and employee data, those are some of the reasons why optimizing on trust. Like, I'll give an example to that to localize that. Like, if I'm talking to you, Mamta, and you're like, you should check out this company. I really trust them, right? If you say that to me, that has a huge impact on how I see them as a potential employer.
Yeah, that's so true. Trust takes a long time to build, but you can break it off really easily. So when we're building these new products, when we're thinking about using AI or any new technology, that should be a key metric that we keep that data safe. The companies are trusting us with it. We keep the integrity of it, and we don't let it go into any harmful hands.
Yeah, no, my recommendation for that is to define who is responsible for the use of employee data.
Yeah.
Is it your chief people officer? Is it your CIO? I'm not here to say there's a right or wrong answer. What I am here to say is if you don't have it defined, that is the wrong answer because it's kind of like if you have a bunch of kids and you're away for the weekend and you don't say someone is responsible for anything and you hope for the best, and what kind of home do you come back to? And even when people mean well, right? Like we'll use the Facebook example of how what Cambridge Analytica was using its data, which it claimed like it didn't fully know, but so that the companies don't want that, right? And there's so many technology teams that want to serve the employee, increase productivity, and serve management of the company, and they're going to be inventive and innovative. But if they're not talking to each other and they're all doing their own thing, you don't know how that data is being used.
And it's your employees' data and also your clients' data. So we need to protect both, and it needs to be defined. You're absolutely right. Who owns it? And with the newer companies coming up or the new products coming up, we need to make sure that in the race of getting to the market fast, that we don't lose sight of it.
Yeah. And I think one thing on this that is changing too is the role of our legal teammates
Mhm.
that support employee experience, support IT, HR. Like traditionally, we really expected them to be hyper vigilant just on risk, but not as vigilant around what are the opportunities. So, like you and me, we look at productivity, creativity from workers. That's an incredible capital we want to optimize for. One of the reasons why data governance can be unclear is a lot of those technology and product teams feel like once legal finds out what's happening, they just shut the party down. So you got to get what you can while you can and try to get it into production. And like I've seen that many times, and that's why like when I say that out loud, people laugh because they know it. So that means we're not setting up our legal business partners for success of just being the party stoppers. They need to be the party creators of safe, responsible, and productive AI use cases too, like great product legal partners. So they need to go learn from their colleagues over that are doing that in the product where they're weighing, all right, how much value can we create here? What are the risks? So that's traditionally not been how we look at risk in
Mhm.
the employee experience and in the HR.
That's a very good point. You mentioned about legal. What are other stakeholders that we need to keep in loop or be as partners so that
Yeah. I I think when it comes to bringing Gen AI into, I'll say HR and employee experience, and the reason I say both for folks listening is like HR is kind of a outdated term. I don't look at people as human resources. I don't look at Momta as a human resource. That's not how my mind works. I think much more about the employee experience, but it's helpful so folks know what domain we're talking about, right? So that's why I keep using the term so that folks know what we're talking about. So I would say when we build technology and tools in this, I tend to think of customers in three groups. One is like the CEO, the C staff, and the business strategy, right? Like what do they need to achieve the strategy of the business, right? And then two, I'm thinking about a customer. If I'm building technology, all of our HR teams that have all these domains and functions, they want to provide services better to employees. They want to serve the company better. And I'm thinking about employees. They are a customer in their own right. And great products maintain and build trust and hit goals among all three groups. And a lot of when you ask about ethics, it's often when you're prioritizing one and starting to hide information from the others, right? And it can go off on either of those. So I think those are the three customers that I think about. And depending on what you're building when you say stakeholders, well, if the employee is the customer, then we need some kind of group that represents the employee, right? They need to be a core part of that conversation. And even if they're not the customer, but in data about them is being used, they still need to be a part of that conversation. So, and folks will often say, well, I can't talk to 15,000 people. Yeah, but you can think deeply about who is not currently in the room by experience, by background, by capabilities, by tenure, and how do you bring those voices in a way that they feel empowered to share with you? Like, so there's ways that you can fit in if you're open to listening. And
leverage your ERTs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, and, every AI product that I've built an advisory like that, and I've always partnered with ERGs from back when I built Lex at Workday with the ERGs. The I think when we're new emerging technology, it's an important question to ask as responsible builders. Who has vulnerability in how this is built out? Who could be offended by this? Who could be harmed by this? I love to build because sometimes it's presented like we can either build something or we can be touchy feely. And the answer is you can absolutely do both. And they actually mutually reinforce each other because having a sense of your end user consumer, if they feel like you care
Mhm.
about their trust and about their experience, they will show up and let you know when something's smoke before it becomes fire. That has happened many times, and they'll let you know before you get dragged, because if you're in companies like ours, our workers are very empowered. They have valuable skills and they have low switching costs. And if you mess with them, they will let you know. This is a very empowered worker population. So, anyways, those are some of the stakeholders that come to mind.
Yeah, and I would even say that we probably shouldn't be just thinking of it just touchy and feely. It is a business objective we should be tracking, and it should be considered as part of the ongoing narrative as you're building products.
A
Because
hundred
again, if the
percent.
trust is broken, the harm is done.
No,
And
100%. And I was being, you know, you with that, like I was using the words that sometimes folks use to lessen that
Mhm.
area. That's not, I don't actually, when I'm doing a product roadmap, have like a touchy-feely feature section. I like
No,
for
I know you don't. You're very inclusive, but then a lot of times product managers are not even thinking about this. So they need to be thinking about this. This is not just a nice to have. It should be one of the requirements going in.
and I also feel when you nudge in and you talk to a PM about some of the products they most admire, there's some aspect of inclusion that led to its transformative growth, right? You
Yeah.
know, it's a real valuable business capability. And I think what it comes down to is like, you know, leaders like you and I, we believe everyone's experience matters. Okay. So we believe that. How do we translate that belief into the technology that we build? And that is a capability. And I'm not gonna sit here and say I'm an expert at this capability because every day I realize I have like, I see where my gap is or if I'm under stress, how I'll respond to that. So yeah, it's absolutely a capability.
Charles, a question I ask everyone. How did you learn AI and how do you keep yourself up to date?
Yes. And this goes, the other thing when you're asking the learning and learning styles question, I think like one thing I want to say, continuing on that conversation, is continuous learning was already a thing in our profession in tech, but it's accelerated, right? Like being a part of it, consuming things like this, like the conversation that we're having. So I was an Army intelligence officer and I partnered with NSA. So I had a first eye view of how language and natural language technologies was transforming by just seeing some of our defense use cases in that space. So like that opened up my mind to knowing what is kind of out here. And then when I transitioned into tech, support Whitney's career, but my wife's career, who's a tech and a cloud leader at Microsoft, and I got that veteran fellowship at Workday. So one is I had a manager that knew that I was insatiable about technology, right? And I was really lucky in that because she had been the HR VP to the product org at Workday and she was in HR and she could see like, okay, Charles has a natural aptitude to bring people together to try to build technology. That was a lucky number one thing. Lucky number two thing is my engineering manager on the IT side saw the same thing and they were friends, right? So like those two personas coming together. And then lucky number three for me, which was not so lucky for IBM Watson, is IBM didn't meet their cloud
Hmm.
SLA to Workday. So Workday moved its commercial products to AWS, and there was a certain amount of credits that it couldn't get out. So those folks were like, "Hey, we have these free credits. Will you look at the Watson technologies and see if anything would make sense for us?" And the last thing I got really lucky on is IBM had invested a lot in their Coursera courses. So I could work through in the evening their AI proficient, like they had all these courses with labs, and it was really cool there. And that's how I built Lex. It was a homegrown product on that cloud instance. So I think when I got all that activating energy, which was a combination of luck, sponsorship, I like, you may or may not ask me this, Mamta, but I do think about, what if I look differently than the way I look? Would I have gotten those sponsors as easily? Would they have let me build something? And I don't know the answer to that, but I want to live in a workplace where that does happen, right? So that's what I'm working towards there. But that helped me get the brand, right? And then when Autodesk came and recruited, it was based on proven delivery of AI into employee experience. And I went from 1 to 3 products. And staying up to speed in this is it for me, I'm an audio learner and I'm a relationship based person. So it's like I find leaders I admire like you, and I maintain relationships over years that aren't just transactional. It's also like I like the values of these leaders and what they represent. I want to support, and then I learn about technology on the way. So that's what works for me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think everyone is different. So, really knowing what works for you and adapting to that is quite important. There's a lot of resources, whatever works for our listeners. But the main thing is to continuously learning, as you mentioned, because this field is changing faster. And I have not seen acceleration like this with anything that has come before. And I have been in the industry for over 20 years.
One thing I want to say to our listeners too, like sharing before it's perfect and creating content before, which is what you're doing and you're modeling here, and I'm trying to do with you, because that really activates you into the knowledge, right? Is that sense of shared vulnerability that you and I are in. We're going to share something and we're figuring it out as we go. So finding those spaces, like you said, some folks are readers, some folks are writers, some folks are listeners, some folks are talkers like me. What are the ways that you can engage in this emerging technology and create content with this emerging technology?
Yeah, and another thing I would say is that me and Charles both love to ask questions. So, and that's what we need to keep doing. So, I would encourage everyone, and I encourage everyone that I even mentor, that you got to ask questions. Just because things are done in a certain way doesn't mean it's right, unless you ask questions and unless you keep asking. And it's so important in this AI and the pace that it's moving at. So, if no one in your company is talking about data governance, be the first one to ask the question. If no one is asking about including people, be the first one to do that. Even asking those questions, sometimes people are just not consciously thinking about it. So bring those ideas, bring those, processes or those thought processes into the conversation so that we are all doing our parts in this ever-changing
Well,
landscape
I
of
love that. I
technology.
love that. Those questions of, yeah, who's responsible for how this data is used? Who could be harmed in how we do this? How do we mitigate that? Yeah, I think, one thing I'm just gonna say as a guy too is like, I'm all about that question of mitigating harm. What I don't like in the workplace when it's expected that women need to be doing that work and not paid or valued for it, because I do see that sometimes in how we're looking at risk and how we're looking at, it's like who gets to move fast and break everything. That's my one. It's not a hesitation, but it's like we all need to care about AI and HR. We all need to care about it. We all need to be visible in it. I don't want it to be just a certain group is seen as responsible for it, and we don't pay them or recognize them for that
Yeah.
observation.
Absolutely. Both in companies and in personal life also. Just because you're using AI, you're using some tool, and there's dozens coming out every day, read the privacy notice. Read how they're going to be using your data. Even as an end user, you need to be doing those things. So it's everyone's
Well,
responsibility.
yeah, and and look, we're gonna learn more about this, but just based on what I was looking at with this new release of GPT and the way it looks like it's using Scarlett Johansson's voice, and she was very clear of like, don't use my voice, but like, it's like, yeah, 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 we're gonna. I mean, that's what it looks like. We'll learn more and see what happened. But that's a great example of like, no, if someone says don't use my voice, we don't use their voice. Like, that's a great example that we're all watching of like, how do we use this emerging
Yeah.
technology? I know you didn't
Yeah.
ask me about this, but having
Yeah.
a conversation, it's like, I think Mamta and I it's also important for us to say there's so much that we're responsible for as leaders. We're going to do our best. We also need legislation.
Yeah,
With like, if you were talking about how do we do AI and HR ethically, absolutely, there's a lot of responsibility on the company, on the tech builders, but there's a responsibility on our elected representatives to give us guidelines in these areas too, because companies have that responsibility to show earnings quarterly to their shareholders. I get that. Whereas, like, if they're going to follow and always do what's right, they're going to need more legislation to provide guidance here.
absolutely. It's like long, long time back when there was not a lot of traffic and we didn't have a lot of cars. Like we used to have those turnarounds and it was okay. But then there was a need for the signals, the red light, the yellow light, and the green light. I feel like we are at that stage again. So we definitely need legislation, but I think the governments are still catching up to that. They also need to move at a faster pace. So we need this governance at three levels I see. One is definitely at the government level. Second one is at the company's level. And then the third one is the end user level. So all of us, we have to do our part. But yes, a lot of the guardrails, it does need to come from those laws and legislations.
And, one thing I would say when you asked me about the example product managers, like just as managers, those of us that have led teams or built products, we all leave a legacy. It's either a debt or an asset behind, and I want anyone that's been an end user of something I built, I want them to know that like I take super seriously and will be very transparent with them about how we use data, how we make these kinds of decisions.
Charles, you're also part of the technical advisory group to US Army and you have served, you're a veteran. So share some insights, what kind of technical advisory that you're giving to them and what they're looking at.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really try to press home there is the different talents and capabilities that we need to solve the problems and take advantage of the opportunities that we have. And when I say different talent, I'm not saying necessarily we need a different person. Like we have a Charles and we need a Mamta, although that might be true in some cases. Even with the talent we have, how are we developing them in? You and I, we've been in cutting edge technology here in the Silicon Valley for years, and we're overwhelmed by the speed of change now as Gen AI comes in. So imagine a more mature organization, the US Army is, I think, our oldest and our biggest institution in the US. So I really try to focus it on what are the capabilities and jobs that we need to both regulate, to understand, because a lot of the jobs that are in the US Army are the same ones that when I became a soldier 20 years ago. And even though they utilize me as a enterprise technologist and AI technologist, in their personnel systems, it just says major of intelligence. It has like the old jobs, right? So how do we create this new architecture of capabilities here and bring them into the uniform force? And that's not just unique for the Army. We see our civil service, a state, federal, and local level doing that too. They need the capabilities of folks like me and you and our team. So I think we're gonna get there. Like it takes a lot of change. Like there's a policy, there's a legislative aspect, that the Army is beloved American institution. So anytime we try to change it, there's a lot of like, don't touch it, But I think we're gonna get there. And you've probably seen too, and I know you're a mom of Gen Zs, we haven't really been able to connect our mission of service with that generation. And I think there's not to oversimplify it, but one of the gaps I've seen talking to a lot of Gen Zs is they want to do modern emerging technology oriented jobs. So if we give them opportunities to serve their country and keep it safe and learn cool technology, a lot of them are going to be interested in doing that. So those are things that I'm really hopeful for.
Absolutely. That'll be a really good combination. I think a lot of our Gen Zs and even Gen Alpha will be excited about. So, as we look to the future, Charles, where do you see this going? Like 10 years from now, where do you see?
Because it's so immense and just the amount of change we've seen over the last year, I'm going to think about it more in the workplace because it's like that's doesn't make my brain explode as much as the other ones. I'll talk about an area of change that I predict in that I'm actually excited about. We've done a good job of I feel like naming some of the risks. Although one thing I do want to name from an employee perspective we didn't get into Employees really want to understand how layoff decisions are made. I'm just going to say that again. Employees really want to understand how layoff decisions are made. So, if you have Gen AI in your stack that is informing what you call workforce optimization, that is an area of a lot of sensitivity here. But going back to future work, let's say you're running a company and I join it, and when you intake me into the company, it's going to ask, "Hey, can we import all of your LinkedIn data and all the things you've led? And can we, hey, I noticed you did this podcast. Can we import that?" And if you're leading the company, I'll get to decide what I bring in about me. And then it's like, hey, can we reach out to you when we're trying to solve problems that are uniquely suited to your background, your capabilities, what you've done? And because right now, a lot of like who gets a special project or who gets an accelerated promotion is based on sponsorship, which is often not based on scientific things around work or merit. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Mamta was at my wedding. We had a good time. I think she could run this division. This is an area that I'm excited about. Gen AI can help us actually center on the right capabilities and experiences and have to justify ourselves more if we are not following them. Like the example I like is when a judge wants to give a more severe than an algorithmic average, that judge needs to justify why, right? So like those big stretch roles let us use some of this technology and emerging to really center on the right leaders. So that's an area I'm excited about that I could really see being transformative.
So we can be a lot more data driven. We can base our decisions on actual performance and actual capabilities and skills rather than just very subjectively, which is what's done today.
Yeah, like let's say you're building a product and you're taking it to these countries in EMEA, and you literally have 3 or 4 workers that worked together in another company and did that very successfully. How do you get them either in the advisory or to lead that, right? Whereas right now, it's like I have goodwill to some of how it happens now because you don't have access to those kind of data and insight. But with this new technology, yes, you do. You just to surface those things in the right way, you need employee trust. Because if you're like, "Hey, let me learn everything about you and what you've done professionally and not tell you how I'm gonna use that." No, 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 I'm good. So the use case that we just said takes trust to run.
And what are some of the things you're scared about?
Yeah, to think like access as as overwhelming as it is, people like you and I are learning and have access to these technologies and are using them. And if we have a world platform changing technology, but only a small group of humans have access to it and can co-create on it, is it going to exaggerate the power imbalance between people? So that's a worry that I have. And because my wife's an infra leader, I know that not everyone has access to the internet, to Wi-Fi, to the digital infrastructure where they can start co-creating things with LLM. My hope is that these are tools that increase shared dignity and equality between us. And my worry is that these are things that increase power imbalances and predatory behavior between groups of people.
Yeah, that's my biggest worry too. And it starts definitely with access, but also with how data is collected. If there's like, we are already seen there are biases, there are, the data that's trained on. I always take the analogy of a juicer, garbage in, garbage out. If you put a lot of carbs in, you can't, just because it's in a blender, it's not a healthy drink. If you put fruit and veggies in, and then, you get healthy stuff out. So if you're not even having the right data to start with, which we've already seen, there's already a widening gap. That's my biggest worry. Also, by the time it actually gets to access, it gets to the use of these products, that gap is going to get widened. And as you mentioned, the power imbalance, I feel we're going to see more and more of that.
So when you say that, I get to ask you a question here. Is that what you predict what you happen, or something you're concerned may happen, or you're kind of figuring out between those?
I think all of us are just trying to figure it out. It's a big concern, but I can already see that happening. Even we were talking about the harm about the data, and just this week, Slack, right? They, even if you've been using it for a while, they changed their terms. And if you don't opt out, your data will be used to train the models. That's one thing, right? And this is the data we're using to train the models, but it's coming from these corporations with certain dynamics, certain demographics. Is it all of the voices? There's multiple things wrong with that. First of all, like we should not be having people opt out. It should be very clear when they're changing the term. So there was a big backlash. Secondly, these models, some of them, we know what the intent is today. What are they getting trained for? The rest, we're just collecting. And we've been collecting it for the last 15, 20 years, ever since the internet came out. Things like if you search on Google Maps and you say, I want to go to this grocery store, it tells you the timings that it's the most busiest at. How did it get that? Because they've been collecting the data on who is searching for different locations at different hours and then aggregating it and then serving it in this form. When they started collecting this data, this feature didn't exist. So that's one of my biggest worries, that one is that data that is being used, it's already has a lot of biases. People have been talking about it. Dr. Fife from Stanford has been talking about
Yeah.
it for a long time. And then the second thing is the data that is being collected, even though we are aware of it now and we keep consent to it now, later they may change its use. And it's not just about my privacy. I'm actually thinking about the next generations where they are so tech savvy, everything is online, and we just don't know with all of these open AI tools that are coming up how they will be using and reusing the data. You gave an example of, the voice from her, even though she didn't give consent to it, it was still used. And this was a celebrity. She was able to say it. And,
Yeah, she's
the
someone
story
with
came
power
out.
and access to resources and great lawyers. So
Yeah.
so we
And
look at
for
her
other
and
other people, like,
the
a
government. Yeah.
simple person, a teenager, her picture, like, how is it going to get used? How is the voice going to get used? We just don't have a lot of grasp on these areas.
So I have two thoughts on this, connecting to our earlier conversation of how I try to support our Army senior leaders around capabilities and experience, technology experiences. I'm a big advocate of leaders like us doing some time in federal service to inform how we do legislation in this area, right? Because right now, that I don't know many that are helping in the public sector side, right? And some of that is that public sector also needs to evolve around digital, because you need someone on the team that understands how it's built if you're gonna legislate it, and we don't have that right now. And then my second thought listening to you is, folks that know me know, Monta knows I come from, my family is very conservative on one side and very liberal on the other. And in the 2016 election, just pre-Gen AI, how they were all getting, my word, manipulated to be angrier and angrier. I can only imagine what that would look like with full Gen AI enablement, especially the elderly folks in my family who I think are more susceptible to certain kind of hacking and manipulation through these tools. So that's something I'm worried about too. With these big, huge elections. I know we got one going on in India here and then in the US. So what role is this technology going to play to potentially destabilize in these elections?
Yeah. Absolutely. Lot to think about, but I'll just reiterate what you said, that we need to make sure that we are building trust, we are not breaking it. And then the other one is that we need to be doing our parts.
Yeah, we need companies, technology builders, and our government and legislation, right? I think there's a global aspect there too. In that, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but there's something I feel like how we globally need to be working together around things like this. This was fun. I appreciate you, Mamta. And I've had a lot of demand to help some of these companies and services and define their AI and HR use cases. And I'm going to be doing some work in this area. So it's helpful
Nice.
for me. I realize it's a very unique and differentiated and important area.
I'm glad you're doing this work. Someone who actually thinks about it from all angles, from a business angle, from a product angle, from an inclusivity angle, from a risk angle, from a trust angle. So I'm glad from
Yeah,
that.
it's where I'm going
You
to
know what?
build. It's where somewhat accidentally, somewhat intentionally, I found my career, and now I'm going to grow where I've been planted. So, and those weren't the easiest years, those workday years. but they really toughened me and
Yeah.
helped.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's been a very, very insightful conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners learn a lot around data governance, data transparency, about trust and potential harm, and about doing the right thing in products and in technology.
Thanks so much, Manta. And I would say to our folks, like, consider a career in HR. HR is an amazing domain, and especially as we implement these emerging technologies in a high trust and inclusive way, I think it's a really exciting place too. I also want our folks to know that.
Awesome. Thank you.